Sacred attention therapy is an approach to liberation. The first liberation is from the conditioned self, psychology of early life. The second liberation is from the realization of the true nature, the fulfillment of oneself as a personality. And the third liberation is the liberation into the life of spirituality and spiritual practice. Sacred attention therapy, or SAT, is a meta-psychology because it embraces not only the physical, emotional, mental and energetic aspects of the human being, but also the spiritual and the transcendental. Therefore, it is uniquely placed to be an applied psychology through counselling and psychotherapy in the 21st century, in which human beings are more complex than ever before.
Welcome to the second in a series of interviews with Richard Harvey. My name is Rob Meager. Today's interview will discuss the lecture Penetrating Wisdom from the Hsüan Hsüeh Discourses. This lecture is available in written form in Bodhi Ocean, an ebook that is forthcoming from the books page of the Sacred Attention Therapy website. You can listen to the full recording of many of the lectures on the lectures page. And lastly, you can view many other interviews on the videos page of the Sacred Attention Therapy website or on our YouTube channel. The URL for our website is www.sacredattentiontherapy.com. And on our website, you can click on the YouTube channel icon to view our YouTube channel. And now a little bit of background about Richard Harvey. Richard is a psychospiritual psychotherapist and spiritual teacher. His work emerged out of the human potential movement of the 1970s. He trained with many teachers in humanistic and transpersonal approaches. He is the founder of Sacred Attention Therapy, a radical new approach to inner work for the 21st century that proposes a three-stage model of human awakening. Richard is the author of Your Essential Self and the Flight of Consciousness, among many other publications. He works with people all around the world, and his forthcoming book is entitled Your Sacred Calling. And it's now my pleasure to welcome to the call Richard Harvey.
Hi, Robert.
Greetings.
Good to see you.
Good to see you. Nice to be with you.
And with you.
We're here to talk about Penetrating Wisdom, which is the first in this 5-part lecture series, the Hsüan Hsüeh Discourses. And you open this lecture on Penetrating Wisdom with the following statement. The subject of this talk is penetrating wisdom. Penetrating is meant in the active sense. You have to work at attaining wisdom. Sometimes wisdom simply arises and is accepted as a spontaneous gift, but in reality, much of the time we have to bring effort and persistence to it. So this lecture is about how we return again and again until we have it, the pearl beyond price, the crest jewel, all-encompassing and inwardly arising wisdom, end quote. So my question for you, Richard, is some spiritual teachings suggest, for example, that we don't have to strive for enlightenment because we are enlightenment. Equally, some teachings suggest that we don't have to try to be loving, simply realize that we are love. Does the same hold true for wisdom? Or do we really have to work at attaining wisdom?
I think it's the same and it's different in the sense that inner work, of course, is a process of taking away, relinquishing, shedding. You have to stop that which you're doing, which is automatic or which is related to habit, or himsa in Hindi. It's this idea of sinfulness being related to habit or unconscious life, unawakened behavior, and a meeting, a lack of meeting, if you will, with the world. When you stop doing those automatic things which stem from conditioning and survival strategies for the individual self, wisdom which is impersonal arises, because we're not talking here, of course, of knowledge or something that's focused or stark or sharp in some kind of way. We're talking about an ocean. We're talking about something. The pearl beyond price is the ocean beyond distance. To apprehend all truth within your organism means you go beyond the separate, divided individual identity of self to an impersonal place. And of course, most of us are so attached out of fear and longing to the personal individual life. We protect it like a castle. We protect it with an army. We protect it with everything we've got. We will throw at the enemy, so to speak. Well, the enemy turns out to be ourselves, and us contracting and limiting ourselves into the individual space means that we relinquish actually everything of any true value. Wisdom, then, is the impersonal ocean in which we in a sense swim, but we in a sense also contain the entire thing. And the price of admittance to that is ourself.
Richard, what role, if any, does discipline through spiritual practice have to play in obtaining this wisdom? A little bit of background. Recently met with the Dear Soul, and of course they were in a dark night of the soul, and it was revealed throughout the session that it's been this kind of journey for them, and when they're in the peak, they're dedicated to their spiritual discipline, but when they're in the trough, they realize that they've let it wane, they've let their spiritual practice wane. And it's always a wonderful reminder to me of that saying, don't use God as a spare tire, let him drive the car. That is, we only reach out to the divine when we're broken down on the side of the road. Once the travel, seems to be going fine, we forget about the divine. Anyway, coming back to my question, what role does discipline in the spiritual practice, if any, play in attaining the wisdom that you talk about here?
What you were just saying, it also reminds me of another phrase, fair weather spirituality.
Right.
Only when it's sunny. It's different for different people. I mean, we can read these wonderful accounts. For example, if you look at the lineage of Dogen Zenji in the book Zen is Eternal Life by Roshi Kennett, there's this wonderful sequence of anecdotes of the enlightenment of the masters of the Soto Zen lineage. Now, this is just a wonderful read apart from anything else, but occasionally, not always by any means, but occasionally you will have in this, I forget now, but it's maybe 100 and something, different accounts of the enlightenment moment of the patriarchs of Soto Zen. So these are the leaders, these are the guys who were transmitted directly from Dogen Zenji. It's like being a transmission from the Buddha himself. One guy, at least, I recall memorably, is drunk and lying in the gutter when he looks up, and he hasn't done spiritual practice, this fella. And he looks up and he sees a leaf falling from the tree. That's it. That's the moment. There's a similar Who's that fellow we've talked about before? Not Father Brown, but the wonderful monk whose name escapes me at the moment, who looked after the sandals of the monks in the monastery, and then he has his epiphany, and then guess what? He looks after the sandals of the monks in the monastery. It doesn't kind of change anything. But his epiphany comes from observing a tree. And in that observation of the tree, in that moment, he sees that the tree will shed its leaves, and then it will go through the autumn and the winter and into the spring, and then it will transform, and something of this metaphor or symbol or whatever provides the epiphany. Anything may do it, and it seems that it's not necessary to have even participated in spiritual practice. But what I want to say about it is, for the common guy, most of us, nearly all of us, who won't lie around in a gutter looking up at a leaf-falling tree and then become a Zen patriarch or whatever, we do what's necessary in order to prepare the ground for the growth.
Right.
And that turns out to be moving into stillness, moving away from restlessness, moving away from the ceaseless habit of following fears and desires and everything that supports us in the delusion of the separate self. So what I want to say is, let's all just assume that we're just common or garden kinds of people and we're going to practice. Practice in itself is a pleasure. And let's dedicate what we do to our spiritual endeavor because we're that way inclined, and then maybe we're increasing the chances of the leaf or whatever. And if you just happen to be in the minority, the sort of 0.0000001% of guys who can lie around, have a life of pleasure and debauchery for 30 or 50 years and then lie around and something's going to happen, you'll know it sooner or later.
You share a wonderful Sufi story in this lecture that for me speaks to the invitation to practice non-judgment. Now, in this Sufi story, the disciple witnesses the master murder someone and sink a boat. Two separate occasions, two separate events. Now, the master explains in his actions to the disciple, the man he murdered would have become a serial killer of many innocent people. And the ship he sank contained an arsenal of concealed weaponry that would have been used to start a local war, etc. Now, the moral of this story, as you share it, is how can we interfere unless we see the full picture? And how can we see the whole before we become whole ourselves? So my question is does this story also teach us about judgment and non-judgment?
Oh, yeah. And can we preface it by saying if anybody listening or subsequently listening to this interview knows where that story comes from, I'd like to find it again. It's one of those things. I have no idea where it's sourced from. And I'd love to remember or to know, to find out. Yes, it's to do with judgment. And my experience is that the spiritual practice of devotion of the heart to the intermediary, to the guide, to the spiritual teacher, is of course an invitation to reflect the absolute. What that means is, it's commonly seen anyway, is that when the spiritual teacher or the guru in the East, the spiritual master, the spiritual guide, behaves in a way that's apparently even human, really, or prone to some kind of criticism, that in a sense, and I'm going to say this because this is the way I see it, the not totally committed devotee, disciple, pupil, follower will withdraw in some way. Now, this may be a kind of test where the pupil or disciple then falls back and says, we let go of that. I've forgotten that. You go on in devotion and in relationship, correct relationship. But there's another kind of devotion which allows even those things which are open to criticism, and the mind of judgment comes in And when that happens, the heart of devotion, of course, is sidelined. And then you're in a kind of ordinary relationship or a human relationship, or at least judgmental mind is there, and you've forgotten something I was talking about just this morning with somebody, which is when you go into the monastery, you create all these extraordinary relationships with people you don't even know, people you don't even talk to, people who are just there. And one day it dawns on you that this is very like your world has always been. In or out of the monastery, you need somebody to dislike, you need somebody to desire, you need someone to look up to, you need all these multiple dynamics. Why? Because you yourself don't know yourself yet. And so there's an inner-outer, this world of projection and inherent judgment. The relationship with the spiritual teacher, as illustrated in this rather extreme story, which is, I think, the bit that you left out, was the master actually says to the fellow who's canvassing to be a pupil, who says, you wouldn't make it 5 minutes with me. And the guy says, well, sure I would. And so then, of course, this extraordinary challenging behavior, but proves what the master's already foresawn, which is that this guy can't make it, or at least it's a test for him to go through. So in conclusion, this relationship with, if you're going to take on a guide, a spiritual teacher, or indeed if your heart is going to, quite without your personal will, if your heart is going to connect to a spiritual guide, a teacher, a guru, out of a wave, a feeling of devotional relationship, judgment, of course, is sidestepped. Otherwise, you've given the lie to it.
In analyzing the two characters in the Taoist story, the master and Huang Ti, which is part of the lecture Penetrating Wisdom, you suggest that all social interaction is aimed at one thing: the preservation of the ego. So my question is, in your experience, when someone has transcended their ego, what does social interaction with this person look and feel like?
Yeah, it's well put. It's a lovely question, isn't it? In my experience, there is a freedom, there is an inability to kind of nail that person down. There's a lightness, there's a generosity of spirit. There's a feeling that you can't somehow focus on them almost. Sometimes even when I was young, I had this experience even physically. I can't quite see, where are they, what are they saying? You can't necessarily even hear them. At other times it's just a very ordinary set of exchanges, but somehow light. And of course it doesn't, or I think this is true, it doesn't tend to engage your ego defenses in some way. There's just not enough frisson, to in any way bring up some sense of the habitual conflict or the habitual intimidation, whereby we usually, all of us, I would say universally, for argument's sake, are involved in this business of seduction and impression and reputation and status, and what kind of image can I project. And I think if we ask ourselves that question, that's a good start in psycho-spiritual work. If you actually ask yourself that basic question, I go to a party or a social gathering or a meeting of some sort, inevitably in a kind of armoring all around me, in order to uphold this kind of dead thing, a sort of image, a kind of cartoon. What is that? And then how can I possibly, through that armoring, perceive that person who isn't playing that game? That's the one.
It's equally valuable to ask oneself in that inner work, who is showing up?
Who is showing up?
When you walk into that room, Whether they be 2 other people or 20 other people, who's showing up?
Yeah.
Because we
Yeah.
discover that different aspects to our personality show up in different settings. The story of carrying fuel, which is again another story as part of this lecture, Penetrating Wisdom. Among other things, it brings to light how one of the characters, in this case Indra, devoted almost his entire life to spiritual practice. And what I wanted to ask is, don't we all, whether consciously or not, devote our entire life to spiritual practice?
I'm not of the egalitarian school. I mean, I would just say this quite plainly. I'm not. I think, in a sense, it's right to say everybody's spiritual in the sense that everything is spiritual. But it doesn't mean, for example, that my dog or the stone outside my window will have a comparable spiritual experience to myself or someone who's walking down the path here now to see me or something. The fact is, some people have a deeper and more authentic and more applied spiritual tendency than others. Some people apparently don't have any at all. In psychospiritual psychotherapy, I suggest we don't try and, for example, inculcate spiritual values or a spiritual perspective or anything of the kind onto anybody who doesn't already have it or brings it. What we do is we just see it that way. We kind of bear that in mind, that it's got this more expansive, broader context than just, oh, there's the problem. And, you kind of focus like this. You see it in big as spiritual teaching, spiritual lessons, but also expansive enough to say, well, this person, all intents and purposes in this lifetime, doesn't seem to have a spiritual molecule about them, even though I don't think anything isn't spiritual, right? And in that, I think, comes a compassion, an action of compassion, expression of compassion, to accept people where they are, even in materialism, even in exclusively relative world or role identification, or whatever it is that they've got. And to bear in mind that visibly, demonstratively, spirituality isn't an issue for very possibly the majority of humanity. It's something I've been toying with recently, is if we are 7.5 billion, heading towards 9 in the next few decades, a fantastic number at this point, and if we're looking for this sort of small million, which I mentioned in Your Essential Self, which may be a tipping point, this kind of possibly reasonable idea, and perhaps it's just an idea, who knows? But even this idea of a certain number of million, we've still got to take away the people who like the idea of the spiritual, who are many, and in the end are basically concerned with the desire body and or the fear body and materialism or whatever. And we've got to take those people out in all acceptance and compassion. And what are we left with? I don't know, but it's certainly a minority. So you're likely to meet people, even proclaimed spiritual people, who actually are not at all. Not in the strict sense.
This is a nice segue into my next inquiry with you. You end the lecture on this note, and I'm just going to read 3 paragraphs from the lecture. Huang Ti and Indra, in their respective traditions, offer us examples of the sincere seeker after truth. They are willing to do penance and to return, to come again and again if necessary to attain the truth, the wisdom they seek. In the first stage of awakening, which I have called the process of self-discovery, or the journey around the self, we do something similar. Whereas some begin inner work and are satisfied after a short time when some symptomatic problem is solved, others remain in the sacrificial fire and not content until they discover the ultimate. To do this, they must return again and again and again, carrying the fuel of new enthusiasm, application, and persistence. Inner work is extraordinarily hard. It is not for the faint-hearted, the weak, or the shallow. You do not receive a degree or a diploma for doing it. There may be no recognition of your great accomplishment and discipline, but it is arguably the most important activity of our life, which enables and empowers you to flourish, to grow, to develop, and to penetrate the deepest wisdom and ultimately transcend even yourself. Leading up to my question, I've observed in the relatively short period of time that I've been offering sacred attention therapy through my own teachings and trainings and services, I recognize it feels like that fewer and fewer people seem willing to engage in inner work. Now, you've been practicing sacred attention therapy for decades, although you may not have called it that, 20 years ago. So my question for you is, what have you observed over the years? Are people more or less willing to engage in inner work?
I think what I have, primarily what I've experienced over the last almost 40 years in this field with people is that perhaps predictably, the product, as it were, has become more shallow. It's become more specialized. It's become more diversified, but it's also become less really what healing and inner work is about, which is representative of the whole, by which I mean, for example, that even in valid psycho-spiritual approaches today, we may have done a 3-day group or a 4-day group that incorporated, say, 20, 25 different things that have now become labeled in some way as specific approaches, whereas we're kind of segued in and out of these things through what we just called a consciousness raising workshop or a therapy group or personal growth group or something like this. So it was a general sort of labeling, and then you notice these other specific labels coming in, and today they've proliferated, and they seem to me to be taking the ingredients out of something I experienced in, say, 1977 or 1975 or something, and kind of commandeered them. I mean, an obvious one, I've mentioned this before because it's so outrageous really, is CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, commandeering a 5,000 to 10,000 year old method from the Indus Valley, from the Hindu Vedanta, as mindfulness, as a new approach added to CBT. It's absolutely absurd. I mean, we didn't even consider mindfulness or awareness as such a kind of ancillary approach. I mean, it was just something that the air was soaked in those early personal growth groups. And that to me is more valid, really. I mean, it was more a part of us than someone saying, here's CBT mindfulness, or, people keep talking to me about, do you know anything about mindfulness, something or other? I think, well, I don't know what to say, I knew it before it was called that, so what really? But that's just an example of things somehow becoming a bit cheaper, becoming a little bit more, here's a product. There wasn't a product as such. It was just, it was weird and mysterious and dark. It's, what's the Hsüan Hsüeh movement thing? Dark and mysterious learning. That's the bunch of lectures we're talking about. There's this wonderful phrase that the Hsüan Hsüeh people practice. I've got that right, dark and mysterious learning, which is lovely, and that's what it felt like. 40 years ago, it felt dark and mysterious and unidentified and certainly unlabelable, and it was experiential, and nobody knew where you were going at all, really, which wasn't always great. It had its downside, all of that. But I think we were sincere, as far as that sincerity having any inner validity in terms of, I want to awaken, I want to jettison my individual self. I don't think it's changed much. in answer to your question directly. I don't think it's changed much for a very long time. I vacillate between optimism and pessimism, but it won't make any difference to me. I mean, I'll do this anyway, but because it's true. But I would never try and persuade somebody, hey, it's a good idea to start jettisoning your identification because, hey, it's the source of all the evil in the world. Now, what's a better reason, But how are you going to convince someone of that nonsense when, they'd rather there was a political reason or a sociological reason or a religious reason or something or other? I don't think any of those reasons stand up to the weight of the separation of the individual identity created out of fear. Therefore, there's only one exalted true purpose for humanity, each individual to get engaged with, and that is be real. Be as you are. Drop the habits.
Wonderful discussion, Richard. When we come together the next time, the next lecture we'll discuss and explore is Transcending Separation. It's the second of the 5-part series, and I look forward to it. Thank you, Richard.
And you. Thank you, Robert.
Bye-bye.
For now.